Hello and welcome to the BCM Game of the Month for December 2015. This is Andrew Martin reporting. Unfortunately, not this time with any glossy pictures from Hamburg. We're back with the board and set. Of course, some might think this is a bonus, not to see my face, but there you go. Well, a word or two first before we start about the way I choose games for this column, because there have been various comments about it. I try to choose games which haven't been covered already by the mainstream chess media. The coverage of tournaments is so good these days and so immediate that, virtually as soon as a game is played, it's out there with annotations for everybody to see. So I try to choose games which are just as good, and let's face it, there's an awful lot of chess going on, but which perhaps haven't been covered already. And so the theme continues this month with a game from the European Team Championship played in November 2015 between Grandmasters Viktor Laznica, representing the Czech Republic, and Yuri Borisek, representing Slovenia. And it's a very interesting example of the exchange Grunfeld. Now, of course, the Grunfeld is characterised by the move d5. It's a very aggressive, fluid continuation for black, and also very popular at the highest level as well as with club players. Invariably, when an opening gets a lot of attention at the highest level, theory tends to be an important factor. And you better not play the Grunfeld these days without having a very good idea of what you're doing. And especially in the line Laznica chooses, perhaps the most commonly played line of all by white, the classical exchange variation, where white puts the bishop on c4. This is a very aggressive placement for the bishop, eyeing the f7 pawn. And white's going to follow this up by putting the knight on e2. Now, the knight on e2 looks rather passive, but it's important that white puts the knight there at this moment for several reasons. The main focus of black's counterplay in this line is the d4 pawn. So black would like to increase the pressure by bringing his bishop out to g4. At that moment, white would probably be able to play f3 because the f pawn is free to go. Another idea for white is that he might play f4 at some point and then f5. The knight comes to g3. Well, this is a very efficient way to start an attack against black's king. And finally, the knight on e2 just reinforces d4. So, all round, a very useful move. So, Borisek plays knight c6. Hitting d4, white defends, black castles, white castles. And now the bishop comes out to g4. One of many moves. White goes f3, as he should. And now, interestingly, bishop comes back to d7. By far the most common move here is knight to a5. And again, then we enter a kind of labyrinth where there are many moves for white and a lot of theory involved. Bishop d7 is a much more modern way to interpret the position. And it's a strange looking move because you think that, black has just given white a free tempo. This move f3 must in some way be useful. But it might not be, and the bishop on d7 is very flexibly placed. In general, black is thinking about advancing his queenside pawns, so the bishop could easily support, for instance, b5 at the right moment. And a final good thing about that bishop is that it vacates the c8 square for a major piece. Black might put a rook on c8. He may sometimes wish to put his queen on c8. So it's up to white to demonstrate that f3 is going to be useful to him. And so far, he hasn't really been able to do this conclusively. Okay, rook to b1. That's about as useful as it gets here. A free move, hitting b7. Black defends with queen to c7. And white brings his queen out to d2. It's very useful for white to be able to strip out this fianchetto bishop at some point with bishop h6. So not only does white connect his rooks with queen to d2, he prepares bishop h6 at a moment's notice. And so Borisek plays a6. Well, that's thematic. I mentioned this move b5. So black is preparing to do this. There are, of course, other moves here. Black may develop his rooks to any of the central squares. He could play rook a d8. He may play rook a c8. He's also played rook f d8. a6 is in general just preparing b5 and saying, well, I don't know quite where I want my rooks just yet. And white brought his rook to c1. Right, well, in a position like this, if I was looking at this for the first time, I'd wonder, why doesn't white take on c5? Because I know it fragments my pawn structure, but I do stop black from playing b5. And the pawn's protected by the bishop on e3. Incidentally, I have to apologise, I've got a slight cold at the moment. That's the legacy of teaching chess in too many schools. Invariably, at the end of term, you just pick up some sort of bug. So as the video wears on, if I have to cough or something, I do apologise. Anyway, back to d takes c5. The problem for white is that it leaves him with a rather immobile pawn structure. You know, yes, he does have double pawns, and one of them's extra, but this is nothing to write home about. And for instance, black can get quite good counterplay here by putting his knight on a5. There was a game where white put his bishop in on d5, provoking e6. The bishop came back, and now black played rook fd8. And after rook fd1, the bishop came to b5 with a pretty good black initiative. For instance, if white plays knight d4 here, black can put his knight in on c4, and this gives black very good counterplay. After bishop takes c4, bishop takes, he's got the bishop pair, very strong bishop on c4, easily compensating for the pawn. And going back to knight c4, if white takes on b5, then black can recapture. And if queen e2, we can whip off that bishop on e3 and go bishop f8. So perhaps it's not so easy for white to keep that pawn on c5 after all. In general, going back, black has found that he need not fear the capture on c5. But of course, he has to have a jolly good idea of what he's going to do against this capture. So that's why, with knowledge as it is among the Grandmaster fraternity, white plays rook fc1. He doesn't want to smash up his pawns at this point. And black goes through with his plan. Well, I suppose white could retreat the bishop and allow black to play c4. And something like this will happen with a very decent black game. As it turns out, white puts his bishop in on d5 so as not to get his bishop frozen out. But of course, this way round, he's got to surrender the bishop once black plays e6 on c6. But Lasnik is quite happy. He thinks he's seen a route to a nice solid advantage here. And he puts the bishop in on h6 to weaken the black king. Of course, white could have played rook a1, but bishop h6 just looks right. Borisek took on h6. White recaptured with the queen. And what white is hoping for is that black's going to allow him the time to start a kingside attack. Having said that, it's not at all easy to generate much of an attack, even with the queen on h6. I mean, what has white got to do? He's probably got to play h4 and h5. He's got to put his knight on f4. But even then, is he threatening to sacrifice on g6? I'm not quite so sure. What white really needs is to be able to put a knight on e4 and then f6. So, for instance, to play e5, knight g3, knight e4, knight f6. But, of course, he's not going to be able to do that. So, despite the fact the queen looks intimidating on h6, black plays rook a2 now, and then rook fa8, and he's starting to generate typical Grunfeld counterplay. I assess this position as about equal, but with everything to play for. White plays rook bd1. Well, in this type of position, you know, you've got to play with your trumps. And white's main trump is the idea that he's going to get a passed d-pawn. This is a very common theme in Grunfeld positions. So white simply stations his rook in behind the d-pawn, getting ready to push it as far as it will go. And the idea is, the further that pawn advances, as long as it doesn't drop off the board, it's going to stop back from creating counterplay. If we compare the line h4 immediately, rook c2, h5, the other rook comes down, takes, let's say, already white's got to start about thinking about defence. He's got to defend the knight, and then black plays queen e7 with, again, typically good Grunfeld counterplay. White is a long way away from pushing his d-pawn to tie black down, and black's got this usual queenside pawn majority there. One day he could create a passed pawn. So black is okay there. Hence, going back to the game, rook bd1. So rook c2 anyway. White plays d5 as he probably should. And after bishop d7, opens up the d file for his rook. Black recaptures with the pawn. Interesting recapture, but quite logical. Really safetying the king a bit more than it otherwise was. The queen could be useful defending the king along the second rank. Rook d2, in comes the black rook. White's hoping by exchanging the rooks at this point, he's going to get a slight endgame advantage. And it seems to be working out like that after e5, rook a1, queen d6 and now h4. But black still has plenty of counterplay, especially along white's second rank. So the king came to g7 and white pressed on with h5. And now black plunged his queen in on d3. Quite interesting here was the immediate b4. Just trying to create a passed pawn. We'll see this theme cropping up a bit later in the game. And if white goes h6 here and then takes on b4, black can take back. And there's not a great deal of value in the pin on a7. So if rook d1, bishop c6, f4, something like this, black has c3. Enabling him to defend after queen a7 check, queen e7. This is a very complex variation. So black tries to keep it slightly more simple by putting his queen in on d3 straight away. White pushes the pawn up to h6. The king goes to f7. And now white plays king f2. White hasn't got a great deal of time here to play with because of the attack on both the queen at e3 and the knight at e2. So king f2. And black played rook to d2. In came the white rook. And now a very interesting move by black. g5. Well, this now move 33 is getting to the point where I imagine both players were getting short of time. So this may be an attempt by black to really complicate things. Rook a7. White plays the natural move, possibly a little short of time. It's interesting to note here that queen takes g5, although it looks suicidal, doesn't turn out that way, because after queen takes e2 check, king g1, amazingly, black doesn't have anything decisive. He can make a draw though with queen e1 check, and after king h2, the excellent rook takes g2 check. Precisely this type of variation that causes havoc when you're in time trouble with your brain, you know, calculating this sort of stuff. But I think it's a draw, whichever way white takes. If he takes with the queen, we go queen h4 check, king g1, queen e1 check. That's a clear draw. And if he takes with the king, we go queen e2 check, king g1, queen e1 check. The only way for white to play for the win is to go king h2, but now queen f2 check, and if queen g2, again we get this draw by repetition. So perhaps white did calculate everything. He didn't want to draw. He goes for the win with rook a7. So black takes the queen off. Thank you very much. There's a check with the rook, and now king e7, safetying the position. It looks as though white, you know, might be a bit better here. If he can just get around his rook around the back and take on h7. But not that easy to do, because always this potential passed pawn on the queen side is really tying him down. I mean, this is probably, you know, an equal position if both sides play neutrally. But white decides to go for it with knight g3. Very interesting stuff. Allowing black to take on c3. In comes the knight check. King goes to d8. There's a check. King c7. And now the point of white's play. He puts his rook on h8. Rook c1. Well, perhaps surprised by the turn of events, black decides to put his rook on a square where he can, at some moment, get immediately in behind the h-pawn. White takes on h7. Black goes b4. Knight e3, b3. And of course, this is a seriously complicated position. Rook g7. b2, on we go. h7. And now black plays what he thinks is his main trump. Rook to h1. Well, of course, with both sides able to queen here, we've got to take a look at b1 queen. Can black make anything of it? White, of course, queens. Well, that knight on a3 is doing an incredible job. So black's probably got to settle for a move like rook c2 check here, jettisoning the exchange, and now queen to c1. Turns out black's got enough counterplay here to generate equal chances. Well, rook h1 was played. Knight d5 check. King comes to d6. White puts his knight on c3. And now a clever move by black. Bishop a4. White went rook g6 check. And now, unfortunately, black starts to make mistakes. Again, I don't know how the situation on the clock was, but this is still a pretty complicated position. Black played king e7. Surprising move that, because it allows white to play rook b6. I think better, we just go back, is king c7, keeping the rook out of b6. And then after rook g7, king d6, rook b7, we have bishop c6. That's the saving grace, probably forcing white to take on b2. Now we take on h7. And the game starts again. It's probably equal, but I slightly prefer black here, to be honest, with that passed pawn on c4. But king e7, why is it bad? Well, in comes the rook to b6. And now black compounds his error with another error. Bishop b3. Looks good at first sight, but in fact it is a blunder. Might be worth you taking a little bit of time to try and work out why it is a mistake. Black should play bishop d7 here. He probably didn't want to allow the knight in. King f7. Now we just get one of those positions where white takes on b2, black takes on h7. White goes rook b7. And king e6, rook b6. Maybe this is problematic for black, just thinking about it here. Knight f6. Well, maybe black could have found some saving grace in that variation, some salvation. As it is, after bishop b3, I hope you found the winning move, rook b8. And unfortunately, black had to resign this position. As well, as you can see, white's threatening h8. The knight does a sterling job covering b1. And if black takes on h7, then we get the skewer, rook b7 check. So white won this exciting game. All in all, I thought that was a very good example of the type of fight that you can expect in the exchange Grunfeld. You know, black had plenty of chances throughout the game. In the end, white won just by perseverance more than anything else. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to the pleasure of your company next month.